Hi, team. So in our today's session, we are actually going to see that how you can solve privilege access management in a hybrid environment with HashiCorp Cloud Platform Boundary, which is in other words called as HCP Boundary. And we'll see that what different kind of challenges do these organizations face with respect to networking, right? So before jumping further, I quickly want to touch base on two terms. One is HashiCorp Cloud Platform and the other is Boundary. So HashiCorp Cloud Platform is a fully managed platform from HashiCorp, which offers you various HashiCorp products as services. So you can spin up a Boundary cluster, you can spin up a console cluster or a package registry or a vault cluster, right? Whereas on the other hand, Boundary is one of the HashiCorp's product for privilege access management. So basically, it's a PAM solution from HashiCorp, and it works on the philosophy of zero trust security, right? So basically, users have to authenticate themselves, and based on their authorization roles and permissions, they'll see certain set of hosts which they are authorized to see or connect to. And then finally, Boundary can further be integrated with HashiCorp Vault in order to generate dynamic secrets for that particular service, right? So coming back to our main agenda for today. So before jumping on to the challenge of an ingress worker, right? First, let's quickly take a minute to understand how this whole workflow actually works, right? So as a user, what happens is I connect to a HCP Boundary, right? I authenticate to Boundary using any identity provider which has been configured by the Boundary administrator. So this is done by the control plane of the Boundary cluster, right? And based on some authorization rules, I'll be able to see different targets in my Boundary desktop application, right? And eventually, when I try to connect to that particular target, right, what is going to happen is there is a concept of ingress boundary workers, right? And these workers will be responsible for proxying my connection to the target, right? So now, typically, what happens is my targets or my resources which I have to eventually access, right? These targets are residing in a private network, and these private networks generally have only outbound connectivity. So if that's a requirement which organization has set up, what is going to happen is my ingress worker, which is actually residing in a public or a DMZ network and which is accessible to the clients, this ingress worker won't be able to proxy the connection, right? And that's the reason my user or myself as a boundary user won't be able to proxy the connection to this target. So how do we mitigate this challenge, right? So as part of 0.12 release of HCP Boundary, there was a new feature which was introduced, which is called as multi-hop sessions. So what happens as part of this feature? So as part of this feature, there is a new worker type which has been introduced, which is called as an egress worker. So there hasn't been any change in the ingress workers. It is exactly same as it used to behave before. But now there is a new worker type which has been introduced, which is an egress worker. So now this egress worker can reside in your private network, right? And this private network has only outbound connectivity, right? But this worker now has the access into your host, and it can actually connect to your existing upstream or an ingress worker, which is accessible to the clients, right? So this egress worker can reside in this private network, and eventually this is not accessible to the clients. The worker which is accessible to the clients is the ingress worker, right? So as part of our demo, we are actually going to see this entire setup from scratch, right? So as per as part of my demo, what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to make use of two cloud providers because I'm working in an hybrid environment, right? So I have resources residing in Azure. Also, I have resources residing in AWS, right? So what I'm going to do is, as part of my this demo, I'm going to spin up my egress workers and the targets both in AWS and Azure. And I'm also going to spin up an HCP Boundary cluster from scratch. So without wasting much ado, let's start. So this is HCP platform. This is a brand new UI. So I'm going to go to Boundary and I'm going to deploy a new Boundary cluster. Let's call this cluster as a multi-hop cluster. Okay, just a dummy name for our demo. I'll set up an administrator account for this Boundary cluster, and I'll just give a password to this so that the admin can log in into the Boundary administrator UI. Okay, and I'm going to deploy this Boundary cluster. So you will see that my Boundary admin UI will be available on this particular URL, and this is going to be my Boundary cluster ID, right? So in this cluster ID, I'm going to have a control plane up and running, which is going to be managed by HashiCorp. And I'll also see some KMS workers, which are the HCP workers, which HCP Boundary gives you, right? But we are going to set up our own self-managed workers in the Boundary. So before this is spinning up, let's go to the virtual machine setups, right? So what I've done is I've already created some machines in both Azure and AWS. So I have a target machine, I have an ingress worker, and I have an egress worker. So both of these targets and the egress workers, they are in a private network. You will see that these only have private IPs, they don't have public IPs, and they only have outbound connectivity. Whereas my ingress worker, it has a public IP address, right? It's in a public network, and you will see that I have given opened 9202 port as well, so that my I as a Boundary user can actually connect to this particular worker, right? So this is the Azure setup. So I have 3 machines in Azure. Similar thing is created in AWS as well. So I have an AWS target, and then I have AWS egress workers and AWS ingress workers, right? So you will see that the ingress worker has a public IP, whereas the egress and the my AWS target, they are residing in a private network, private subnet, basically. Okay, so let's see if our cluster is up and running as of now. So yes, so our cluster is up and running. So you will see a tab over here. So let's click on this tab here, right? And we log in into our Boundary cluster. Okay, so we'll try to create these steps manually one by one. Okay, so let's go to our first Boundary ingress worker. So let's go to our Azure ingress worker first of all, right? So we'll set up the ingress worker first, followed by the egress workers, and then we'll create a target, and we'll try to create connect to that particular target, right? So you will see that in this worker, right, I have already installed a utility which is called as Boundary worker, right? So it is running on version 0.12, right? And I have a worker HCL file, right? So let's see what exactly is present in this HCL file, right? So you will see that I'll have to mention my cluster ID because this worker is going to be connected to my Boundary cluster. I'm going to add a listener section, and I'm going to add a worker section, right? So this type of a worker is called a PKI worker, and this basically uses a certification based authentication, right? So this is my public IP address of this Ingress worker, and I've given a tag which is called as Azure Ingress, and this tag is going to be used while I create my target, right? So we'll see this in a later step. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this cluster ID with the cluster ID which was created by HCP Boundary. I'll replace this and save. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to start this PKI worker or the ingress worker, right? So it's a simple command which says boundary worker server and the config file, right? So let's start. So in this part of this step, you'll see you'll get a worker auth registration request. So what I'm going to do is I'm just copy this registration request. I'm going to go to my boundary UI, the HCP boundary UI. I'm going to go to the worker tabs. You'll see that these are the KMS workers which have been created by the HCP deployment which we did, right? So, but in our case, what we are going to do is we are going to create our own KMS workers, right? So all I have to do is just paste this auth registration request here, and I'll just register my worker, right? And if I do a refresh, you will see that now this worker has been registered in my HCP boundary cluster, right? So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to edit the name of this worker because this is an Azure Ingress worker. So I'm just going to give this name as Azure Ingress, right? So my Azure Ingress worker is created, right? So this is running, right? And now what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to create the Azure Ingress worker as well, okay? So let me just log in into the Azure Ingress worker as well. So let me just log in quickly. Okay, so this is my egress worker and this is my PKI worker file, right? So you will see that this doesn't require an HCP boundary cluster ID, but in this case, my worker would require an upstream, right? So this is a downstream worker. It's an egress worker, right? So it needs to know that to which upstream worker or to which ingress worker does it need to connect to, right? So this is the private IP of my ingress worker. So if we go back and go to the virtual machines, you will see that the private IP of my ingress worker is 10.0.0.7, right? So this is what is mentioned here. And the tag which is mentioned on this egress worker is Azure egress, right? So again, I'm going to start the egress worker using the same command. Okay. And in this case also, I'll get a authorization request, right? So what I'm going to do is again, go to the worker, click on new, and just paste this authorization request. Done. Okay, let's rename this quickly. I guess there should be a way of naming your workers while registration. So this is Azure Egress. I'm just going to quickly save it. Go back to the workers. And now if I do a refresh, you will see that now I have Azure Ingress and an Egress worker already up and running. Okay, so now the next step, what we have to do is we have to create a target, right? Because we eventually have to connect to that particular target. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly create a dummy organization. In this organization, I'm going to create a project. Okay, so the project is created and I'm just going to create a target. So this is going to be my Azure target, right? I'll do generic HCP. So what's my target address? So if you see here, the target address is this private IP, right? Which is residing in the target network, private network, sorry. So this is the target address, the default port is 22. And now this is where you'll have to tell that what should be the what kind of chain it is going to connect to, right? Or make a proxy. So we are going to use an ingress filter, and then we are also going to use an egress filter. So basically you'll see here is that the clients usually have access to an ingress worker, and these ingress workers instead they uh, proxy a connection to egress workers, and both egress workers and the host are residing in your private network, right? So in case of ingress worker filter, if you remember, we used the tags while we were creating the workers. So we are going to make use of these tags as filters, right? So this tag for my ingress filter and this tag for my egress filter. So let's copy this and save. Okay, so my target is created. Okay, and now let's try to go to Boundary. This is the Boundary desktop application. So any user who has to connect to the Boundary, he has to use this Boundary desktop application in order to access those targets. So I just copy pasted my Boundary cluster URL here. I'll click on submit and I'll just log in using my admin user. But yeah, in real time, you'll be creating your own users and then giving access to those different targets using the RBAC model, right? So I've logged in and you'll see that I'm able to see this Azure target, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on a connect here and I'm going to see a proxy URL, right? So we have authenticated, we were authorized to see this target. And now this is the last step where I'm going to make this connection, a proxy connection to this target through a chain of workers, ingress and an egress worker. Okay, so I'm just going to take a note of this port. I'm going to go to a terminal in order to access this particular 127.0.0.1-p, and this is my port. And let's see if we are able to connect it. I'll give my password. Normally, you can get this password from HashiCorp Vault. Also, if Boundary is connected. So here you go. So I am connected to my Azure target, right? So similarly, let's try to see the AWS things also. So all my three machines are up and running. One is target, egress, and the ingress worker, right? So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go back to my, so this is my AWS ingress worker, right? It's an Ubuntu machine. You will see that 10.0.14.223 is my ingress worker, right? So I have my PKI worker.hcl. So PKI worker. So let's exactly same worker file as the previous one, and similar to Azure ingress worker. I'm just going to get rid of the old HCP cluster ID. Okay, and I'm going to replace it with my new HCP cluster ID. So this is my cluster ID. This is my public IP address. Everything is same. And you will notice that in this case, my tag is actually AWS ingress. Okay. So quickly save it and we use the same command as before to start the boundary worker. Okay, let's start. Okay, so again, you'll get a authorization request. What I'm going to do is again go back to my workers. So orgs, workers, and I'm going to click on new and just paste this authorization worker and register, right? So in this case, I'm going to just edit this and call this worker as AWS Ingress. Okay, let's save it. Okay, so now I have an AWS Ingress as well. Okay, similarly, what we are going to do is we are going to go to the egress workers. So 10.0.131.50. So if you see, this is going to be my egress worker here, right? Again, this is in private subnet with no inbound connectivity, only outbound connectivity. So what I'm going to do is if I do a cat on this PKI worker, you will see that the upstream for this worker is my AWS Ingress worker. So I've put the private IP of that worker. And in this case, the tag is actually AWS Ingress. Okay. So again, I'm just going to copy this same command for starting my boundary worker. Okay, so I'm going to get an authorization request. I'm going to register another worker here, register worker, done. I'm just going to quickly rename it. I mean, this renaming is only for uh, seeing the changes gracefully. Okay, so oh, it should be grace. Save it. Okay, so now I have 4 workers, 2 for AWS and 2 for Azure. So our egress setup is done. So next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another target, but this time it's going to be an AWS target, right? So AWS target, generate TCP. Okay, so what's my private IP? It's 10 dot. This is my target, which I have to eventually make a proxy connection to. I'm going to put this target address over here, 22. And again, I'm going to use an ingress and an egress filter, right? So for AWS, the ingress is going to be AWS ingress. And for my egress, it's going to be AWS egress, okay? Save, and my target has been created. So if I go back to my Boundary desktop app, I should see a new target over here. Okay, so a new target over here. Let's do a connect. And this is the port which has been given to me by HCP Boundary. I'm going to take a note of this proxy URL. I'm going to make a connection to this. So okay, so I'm going to do, so it's an Amazon Linux EC2 machine. So this is my private key. This is the user at localhost, and I'm going to give this port, right? Yes, perfect. So I'm actually logged in into my private AWS EC2 machine, finally. Yeah, that's it from the demo perspective. And I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you.